My name is Robyn Sullivan, and for my final presentation on my perspective on racial reckonings, I'll be discussing racial reckonings in regards to the self-help era and civil rights era. The two subjects laid the foundation for African American history, showcasing the determination of the Black community to create a life for themselves and separate the race from the slander it had been long associated with. Even after the abolishment of slavery, social and economic injustices were still a major issue for the Black community and often kept them from pursuing opportunities that would provide advancement for them in society. The goals of the self-help era and the civil rights era were to change the misconceptions of the Black community and arm them with the tools they would need for a fulfilling future. In this presentation, I will also be discussing what exactly is a racial reckoning and mentioning the most recent racial reckoning in the African American community. Defining a racial reckoning will allow us to further understand momentous events in African American history and push us to analyze how the lives of Black people have changed over time with the countless racial reckonings that have come and gone. When approaching African American history, people may find themselves asking what exactly is a racial reckoning. A racial reckoning is a period in time where a race must present a public act or dramatic shift in hopes to provoke long-lasting equality or reconstructive change for the well-being of the affected community and the nation. In this presentation specifically, I will be discussing racial reckonings in the Black community. A prime example of a recent racial reckoning would be in the year 2020, where the Black community responded to the unjust killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the shooting of Jacob Blake. This reckoning focused heavily on police brutality and systemic racism, demanding change and repercussions for the blatant disregard of Black lives. This was more than protests and riots, as this movement was a call to action in hopes for at least recognition of the 21st century African American struggles. Contrary to popular belief, racial reckonings consist of more than boycotts and protests, as these are short-term solutions for the long-term issue. Racial reckonings last a long time in hopes to demolish social injustices and economic disparities, in hopes to create a bigger change than the mere battle that they're facing at the time. These social injustices could include racism and discrimination, and the economic disparities could include job opportunities and property ownership. The change a racial reckoning provokes is meant to have a permanent impact on the community, removing the need for another reckoning to occur on the same subject in the future. For my first point on racial reckonings, I will be discussing the self-help era. So self-help, African Americans were hoping to obtain physical space, educational quality, financial stability, healthcare methods, and occupational opportunities, and all of these would be attained using self-help methods. Self-help can be compared to the social media age, with African American people needing to promote a positive image of their success as they aided themselves for the lasting change. Booker T. Washington High School is an example of self-help, with the community putting everything back into it to maintain it. They put in money for the upkeep of the school, making sure they had recreational resources, and taught students everything they would need to know so they could be successful in the future and have a sense of cultural pride. The school was trying to prepare students to become entrepreneurs, but also inform them of the struggles they may face in the Black community with the social injustices that were occurring at the time. In self-help efforts, African Americans went to open schools, doctors' offices, recreation centers, and all for the betterment of the Black community. They wouldn't receive help from anyone else, but the goal was to inspire a culture so Black people could regain their individuality and independence. Self-help was meant to help African Americans gain control of their lives and their future. It was a reaction to disenfranchisement, segregation, and economic oppression in hopes to overcome these struggles and improve their livelihood. For my second point, I will be discussing political rights and the civil rights movement. While slavery had been abolished, African Americans still faced little to no equality in politics and everyday social life. The civil rights movement was meant to overcome this discrimination and violence being inflicted upon African American people to allow them a rightful place in society. The civil rights movement could be defined as a struggle for African Americans to obtain social justice, most prominent in the 1950s and the 1960s. During the civil rights movement, African American people sought legislative changes for individual rights, voting rights, educational and occupational equality, and the removal of economic disparities based on race. There are many events that comprise the civil rights movement, ultimately making it a racial reckoning with the longevity of its happening. Some of the major events included the passing of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, and the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1869. The 14th Amendment freed Black men and women, making them American citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. After that, the end of segregation in the military in World War II was passed by Harry Truman, called Executive Order 9981. This made it where black men were able to fight in the war alongside white men. The Montgomery bus boycotts in 1955 were done in hopes to end segregation on public buses, but this would not come until Boynton versus Virginia in 1960, where segregation of interstate transportation was considered unconstitutional. Brown versus Ford in 1954 made segregation in schools illegal as well, the Little Rock Nine being a notable event that happened during the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 provided prosecution to anyone that prevented someone else from voting and created a commission to investigate voter fraud. The March on Washington was a huge protest meant to advocate for civil and economic rights of African American people. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed equal employment for all, limited the use of voter literacy tests in integrated public facilities. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory voting, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination concerning sale, rental, and financing of houses based on race. Ultimately, all of these events created a racial reckoning, providing lasting change for African American people in society. Not only did they lessen social disparities, but they allowed there to be progression for black people and for them to gain things that they hadn't had before. Now I will be discussing the impact of racial reckoning and how the two eras I've discussed fit into the big picture of African American history. The era of self-help was a period of racial reckoning because it was the beginning of African American people knowing that they wanted more for themselves. They were individuals that wanted new opportunities and intended to create those opportunities for themselves rather than walling over the ones that were being refused to them. While almost all liberties, such as education, jobs, and healthcare, were separated from them due to discrimination, they created solutions to these issues, utilizing their own resources and community members. The Civil Rights era was a period of racial reckoning because it began the long fight for African American people to obtain equal rights and social justice legally and provoke lasting change. Rather than accepting what wasn't being given to the black community due to their race, the Civil Rights era marked African Americans fighting to create these opportunities by obtaining political roles and maintaining a united front against social injustice to evoke change. Many activists and leaders pioneered major change in both of these movements. People such as Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph, and Walter White either led or participated in activities that would aid African American people in their journey to racial equality. With all that being said, both the Civil Rights era and the self-help era are imperative to the African American history because they signify the struggle for social equality for African American people after slavery was abolished. It was not only about removing themselves from the physical enslavement, but from the social and psychological barriers that prohibited them from advancing in a purposefully narrow society. These eras shaped African American history and encouraged continuous advancement for the best outcome possible in the community and for the well-being of society. At the end of all this, you may ask why racial reckonings are necessary in the first place. Racial reckonings occur to bring awareness to major social issues and inequality and change them for the better of the entire race. The reckoning is meant to create opportunities and give African Americans a chance to ascend in a society otherwise working against them. Without these reckonings, change and progression in the black community would be little to none. These reckonings lay the groundwork for major societal change in the long term. And to close, racial reckonings such as the self-help era and the civil rights era are imperative to African American history and provide most of the backing behind the notable changes that altered the lives of black people. Racial reckonings have given black people the chance to prove that they can be something greater than what society has perceived them as. Throughout this class, we have learned about various racial reckonings that have positively and negatively impacted the black community. The goal of each is to spark a change that will lead to the overall betterment of the community. Racial reckonings are still necessary today, pushing us to obtain true equality for the best society possible. While I do not believe we will have another civil rights era, I do believe we are still utilizing self-help methods and hoping to build opportunities for never-ending progression. Hopefully in time, there will come a point where these racial reckonings are just history, and we reach the true potential we have been trying to obtain for years now.